Hi, this is Paul. I have two clips here for you. The first one is from the conversation I did today with Jordan Hall. It was an outstanding conversation today. I watched his conversation with Glenn Scrivener, which I thought was tremendous. I watched his conversation with Paul Antleitner, which I thought was also tremendous. And I think between those two conversations, you can really get a nice sense of, along with other things that are out there from Jordan on the internet, including some past conversations that I've had with him, sense of his journey to Christianity. I can't recommend both Glenn Scrivener and Paul Antleitner's videos. Um, I can't recommend them strongly enough. I thought they're really terrific. And so when I saw that Paul had spoken with Jordan and that was released yesterday, it was like, oh man, what am I going to talk to him today about? So I really tried to sort of pick up on sort of where Paul left off. And the conversation is still in No Ain't No Ads. It'll come out soon. Don't worry about that. But I wanted to get a couple of sections on sort of the story of civilization, its collapse, and anxiety, because I think Jordan Hall is really, really good on that. Earlier in the week, I released a video about contrasting, say, Jordan Hall with Eric Weinstein. We went into that further. But so this is the little section from the video. Probably by the time I release the whole video, I'll probably have the whole thing out in clips anyway. So I do the clips because these big, long conversations are sort of a lot to take in at once. If you really want to see it right away, it's in No Wait, No Ads. But if you don't want to, I'm sort of caching videos because Holy Week is coming. I don't know if I'll make many videos that week. We'll see. So here's a clip from the video I did today with Jordan, and here's the front end of Paul Antleitner's conversation with him. The link to Paul's conversation with him is in the notes. Only 634 or 634 clicks on Paul's video with Jordan. I don't know why Paul's channel isn't larger. Paul does amazing things on his channel. So if you're not subscribed to Paul Antleitner's channel, the name Deep Talks, I don't think helps it. He recognizes that. That's from some conversations that he had. It started as a podcast, but yeah. So they're right here in the comment. They're right here in the thing.
So it looks very much to be the case that cultures and civilizations are different. Cultures, and I'll use like the most sort of fundamental form of culture would be like an indigenous culture. Cultures tend to be able to be relatively stable. They've got a lot of pressures on them that selects for stability. But their stability is premised on two really critical characteristics. One is an enormous amount of context. They're extremely high context, particularly relational context. And therefore, two, they can't scale. You grow past a certain amount of people in the tribe, and the tribe actually forks, and you get what are in fact two tribes that become more and more distant as the population grows and the distance grows. And what this means is that one, you have interceding conflict between all of these different tribes, because once they get past a certain distance from each other, they are ultimately like two peak predators competing in a niche.
But again, simultaneously, both conflict and collaboration. I mean, yeah. and Girard sort of puts that nicely together, that anybody in conflict is also collaborating on both individual projects and projects between them.
Well, the amount of collaboration between two indigenous groups, let's say like the Iroquois and the Sioux, was actually relatively low, quite formalized, quite ritualized, for lots of reasons. And this creates a gradient, it creates a potency. And so what happened was that there was an opportunity for discovering a different kind of social coordination code, a different way of getting groups of human Homo sapiens to hang together and work together and make the whole greater than the sum of its parts, which we call civilization. I'm going to say hi to Paul, or is that his name? Kingsmith. And civilization has the advantage that it can scale, and it has the advantage that it can be cosmopolitan. It can grab and stick a whole bunch of different kinds of groups together, which enables a much higher level of collaboration. And so the collaboration goes way up. And I've written a whole essay about the problem of the city as the centerpiece of civilization. But the basic insight is that we've discovered that this thing that on the internet we call Metcalfe's law, or the network effect, is quite unique in reality. That where human beings come together in collaboration, you get something like an exponential growth along certain valuable things like innovation and wealth production. And so, if you can find a way to get more human beings to come together in collaboration, you're doing something which is unique, very powerful. And this becomes a driver, and it drives more and more people. First, civilization gets sort of discovered. It discovers that one of the first things it can do is it can take 10,000 people and conquer its neighbors who are limited to 200 or 300, and then ingest them into its formal structure. And then it discovers that as you concentrate more people into cities, you get these massive spikes in wealth and innovation. You discover all these cool things like the wheel and writing and whatnot. And you start getting what looks like a really cool takeoff. But the problem is the underlying characteristics of civilization, which I will not go into right now because it's a very long digression, are unstable. They have built-in fragility elements so that they are, as Schmachtenberger says, inexorably self-terminating. So you cannot make a stable civilization. It's just impossible. And so what ends up happening is you get this rise and fall dynamic. Sumerians, they rise, they fall. Then the Akkadians, they rise and they fall. And the Assyrians rise and fall. You just kind of get these continuous dynamics. Sometimes the rise and fall is local. Sometimes the rise and fall is the Bronze Age collapse, and a whole bunch collapse at the same time, largely because they had become interconnected. And so their interconnection allowed them to live longer than they ordinarily would have done so independently. But then that meant that when they started to fall, the fall accelerated it into a bigger collapse. And by the way, as a consequence of the nature of how mind works and how ideas work, once an idea has been discovered, it's relatively easy to teach and therefore relatively easy to transmit. And so even though Sumeria falls, writing doesn't go away. Writing now gets propagated out, and everybody else kind of gets writing for free. So the next reboot starts at, oh, we know how to write. Now let's learn how to do something else. Right? So you get this, what is actually in the field known as nested S-curves. So each civilization is an S-curve, but there's a bigger trend that's going on, which I'm just going to call capital C civilization. So you've got a given civilization, which Daniel may have articulated very well, by the way, to weave these two things together. But then you've got capital C civilization. Now, the problem is, and this is where my eschatological, or my, what we call practical eschatology, comes to its sharp point, is that there's very good reason to believe that we're not at the end of Western civilization. We're at the end of capital C civilization. There may be like one more civilization that might happen, kind of like a China AI robot thing that kind of comes out. But the theory is that the half-lives of civilizations actually decrease. Or to put it another way, the life of a civilization is measured in bandwidth, not in years. So as communication rate and population go up, the actual duration of the civilization goes down. The fragility plays out faster. It squeezes its life into a more intense spike. So whether it's us or it's the next one, the one after that is the end of capital C civilization. Now, this is a very big deal because we've been living in capital C civilization since somewhere in Genesis, right? Maybe Abraham, right? Somewhere very, maybe pre-Noah. I don't know much about that, but certainly Abraham, we're living in capital C civilization. And so that means order of magnitude, we're talking about 1,000 years is not the right order. We're talking about 10,000 year or 100,000 year kind of event. And by the way, having lived through what they call the 1,000-year flood here in Western North Carolina, I can tell you that you're not prepared for a 1,000-year event. It exceeds your expectations in lots of confusing and surprising ways. And so we're definitely not prepared for a 10,000-year or 100,000-year event. And some things to just kind of think about as characteristics of it is, for the very first time ever, as far as we know, the whole world is entrained in a single civilizational matrix. And so when this civilization collapses, there's nowhere else to go. Now, Eric would say, let's go to Mars. By the way, that might not be a bad idea. It's just not the first idea. It may be the third idea. Right. Maybe the appendix idea. So that's never happened. Like when the Bronze Age collapsed, that was a lot of civilizations collapsed, but there was lots of other things going on. And there's a very large periphery, including all of China. And so it was bad and ugly, but whatever. But if this thing collapses, in principle, could be the whole world. The other thing is the magnitude of where we are. Right? The Bronze Age went from making bronze back down to stones for a little while. We're making spaceships, and that's a long way to go. And we've got like 9 billion people living on top of a substrate that requires very high levels of energy and technology and logistics. So as you start to move down, what happens is the carrying capacity collapses even more rapidly. And this creates reciprocal conflict, which is to say that people generally don't like to die. And so when it looks like the carrying capacity is decreasing, the ones who are on the edge of the carrying capacity will become increasingly desperate and, by the way, increasingly innovative, and they will bring it to the guys who are closer in, and this creates a downward spiral. Right? So you've got global and you've got intense at a very unique level. And by the way, I should mention, if you really want to be profound at the theoretic level, if I'm correct, that we're at the end of capital C civilization and we have no idea what else to do. Do we just default back to culture? Maybe, by the way, we've done that several times. It just kind of gets cleaned up in ice ages and we don't notice. And in this case, if we drop all the way down, that's a long reboot. That's a very long reboot. So this is sort of the practical eschatology, saying, hey, it seems like this is just where we are. Right? We can say intelligent things about the kind of systems that we happen to live in, and we can make some predictions about how these things play out. And obviously, you can't have certainty, particularly because this is not a science that you can do experiments on. But nonetheless, we were talking about these things 15 years ago, and we're pretty reasonably formalized 10 years ago and just watched what played out. And we're like, yeah, that looks exactly like we thought it would look like. So here we are. Okay, so that's the practical eschatology side of the equation. Now what I want to do is I want to go back underneath and talk about the meaning crisis piece of it, because this is where the rubber hits the road. And I think I can do this in maybe 3 steps. The first is I'll use a framework: society and community and communion. Society is what civilization builds. Society is what happens when you have a multiplicity, like a group of individuals, let's say, and they're held together by a bunch of extrinsic structures. But they're held together by the rule of law, which means the threat of police taking you to jail. They're held together by various kinds of incentives. Do what we say and you'll get lots of food and lots of TV, et cetera. So they're held together by a bunch of extrinsic forces. But there's very little or no internal binding. Meaning if you turn off the external forces, they're all going to look around and be like, fuck that guy. And this actually happened when we were sitting in the middle of the hurricane. Everything turned off, and there was a 2 or 3 day period where we're like, wow, we're about to be out of food and water, and those are strangers over there. What's going to happen? Okay, so then we go to community. Community is where the relations are coming from the interior out. You actually have relationality. You know people. You know people for a long time. You care about people for reasons that have to do with intimacy and nuance. And therefore, for example, while there may be extrinsic forces, quite often you're actually resisting the extrinsic forces that are trying to capture you and turn you into a society. And if you were to turn off the extrinsic forces, you would just kind of move back to a default mode of community, which again, we in fact actually did. We dodged the society bullet, discovered that we in fact were a community, and noticed how community operates. But the key thing about community is that you can't convert society into community. Community can be converted into society, and community by itself is not stable. Community depends upon communion. And this is, by the way, when we get back to the Christian story. So that's one. That's one piece. I just want to have that out there. The next piece, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but let me just play it out a little bit more. I'll do it in my first person. So you've heard the story where, okay, I accomplished a certain set of objectives or purposes that are considered valuable in our culture. I become rich, I become influential, I become whatever. Or I have personal goals. I'm going to build something and I built it. And I discover, which is many, many people throughout history have discovered, is like, oh, that's kind of neat, but it's not really the thing. All right. So what I do at that point is I say, okay, well, that's fine. I'm not interested in any of those things anymore. I'll just sort of retire into a very simple, wholesome life. I'll be a householder. I'll be in my community. I'll be in my, help at the school, etc. But here's where the real problem lands. For the most part, we don't actually have communities, we have societies. And you can't build wholesome out of society. You can't actually form real friendships. You can't even form real families. Right? The war on the family is not something that's necessarily conscious, but is definitely at the very base of what our society must do by its very nature. Because you have to convert everybody into the formal substrate of the social structure, or you might say the civilization structure. And this involves decontextualizing. It involves moving them out of the intimacy of microculture. By the way, generally for the benefit of producing more material goods.
Yep. Yep.
And we see this in our lives. We saw this, your generation saw this like crazy with the massive boomer diaspora where families just flew apart. Why? Well, I can get a really good job in Sacramento.
Yep.
Well, but you're never going to see your brother or sister again. Or maybe, once a year at Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Yep.
Like, that's weird. And it creates a weird sense of ennui, but I got a really nice car, right? Now you're in a weird spiral. So because our society doesn't actually have the fabric, the material out of which you can truly build wholesome community, even if you're really rich and really dedicated and really committed, like I was, what you notice is, you can't do that with this. It's like trying to build a sandcastle out of dry sand, and there's no water. Right? So you pour it out, and it goes. So this is a part of my journey. Was actually a journey of where could we possibly ever do something like this, and then we'll get to part 3. So that's part 2, which is, let me actually explode part 2 a little bit more. So as more and more people, largely unconsciously, experience the embodied reality of the lack of ordinary meaning that is available in modernity, their strategies, the way that they respond, start to inject into the civilization fabric what are ultimately highly destructive, corrosive, and toxic elements. Some will endeavor to solve the problem by means of inventing they'll want to go to Mars for reasons of feeling like life has purpose or whatever. They'll build pyramids. Some, of course, will go away. Some will self-medicate, but all of this is ultimately a fast or slow degeneracy of the underlying material out of community, out of which society is ultimately parasitizing. This is a variation, I think, on the cut flower story, but a little bit more complexity. So that's part of it is actually as more and more people move out of community into society, as more and more people move out of their local, rich, alive cultures into civilization, the underlying substrate upon which civilization depends is corroded and actually starts to become toxic in the interior of civilization. And then the last piece, the third piece is, okay, we've got a problem. How do we solve it? Well, I know how we solve it. Let's go back to the toolbox of how we solve problems. So let's go find the right tools and let's bring them to solve the problem. But the meta problem is the toolbox is part of the problem. So every time you go back to the toolbox, you come out and you make more problem. This is a really complex loop. And this is metanoia. The only way to truly solve the problem is you have to actually become a different kind of who. You have to change the nature of your identity in a truly fundamental way. And mysteriously enough, not randomly. It needs to change towards the good, right? If you just do a reset, well, I'll just pick a random identity. That's not going to get you anywhere. You need to have some mystical methodology whereby you cannot, by your own understanding, endeavor to address the problems in the world. You cannot, by your own understanding, and attempt to modify who you are. And yet you can, in fact, become radically transformed, but in a way that is actually towards the true and the good. I pose to you, this is a very difficult problem to solve by any means that is available to reason. So those are the 3. So this is how the meaning crisis comes up. And this now puts us on the threshold of the crossover point. So we take a look at it. Eric will look at the problem, and he and I have been talking about this since 2008. So we share roughly the same diagnosis. He initially put all of his hope on the institutions. We need to restore the institutions so that they can do the ordinary thing. And I said, no, they're already fucked, dude. We got to build something completely new. And that's sort of where we were separated. And I think he's largely given up on the institutions. So now he's like, we got to go to Mars. But by the way, in reality, what he wants is to say, what do I need to say and do to convince people to allocate resources to doing fundamental physics? Whatever it needs to be, I'll say it.
Yep.
But you can see this notion of going to Mars is an example of reason endeavoring to solve a problem. And it looks in the toolbox and it says, man, yeah, we are kind of screwed. This thing's going south fast. I know, we'll go somewhere else. Right? It's in the realm of a decent idea.
Yep. Puritans went to America. Pilgrims went to America. I mean, we've been, and Brett has made that argument too. As long as there's a space nearby that's got, less civilization than we have, in we go.
In we go. And this is, again, the point is, it's extremely rational. Like you can actually rationalize it up one way and down the other because it's the product of the best of what rationality can deliver. The best of what rationality can deliver is some variation on that theme.
Yep.
And by the way, the conversation, I've been parts of conversations, and you've probably read some news stories. I think Doug Rushkoff published one quite famously about 8 years ago, where he was hired by 3 very wealthy hedge fund managers. And they kept asking him all these questions. And he's like, what in the world are they talking about? And then all of a sudden it dawned on him. They have concluded that the world is coming to an end. And what they really want to know is how do they build bunkers that will actually survive? Right? Yep. Like, okay, that's a perfectly reason will lead you to that. Yep. Reason says, well, I want to survive. And maybe I want people who I care about to survive. And reason could say, and you really care about everybody, but you can't save everybody. So save who you can. Who can you save? Maybe these 12 people.
And so our prophets in Hollywood have been spinning off these myths and these stories for a long time too. All these dystopian, living in bunkers, et cetera, et cetera.
That's because they're prophets. They're addled prophets, which many prophets are, but uniquely addled prophets. And so they feel the reality and they can't help but express that reality in some narrative way.
Right. And prophets are always biased. Prophets of something else. You have prophets of Baal, and these are prophets of modernity. And so their answers, their prophecies will be in the form of their God.
Nice. That's a very, very good way of putting it. I completely agree with that way of thinking about it. So, okay, so where do we go next?
Well, we've got the meaning crisis coming up, and I think because as we've seen, people instinctively have seen the relevance of the meaning crisis to the individual and the family, which is right there at the level of communion, which, as you rightly note, is the foundational level that allows community, that allows society. And we've seen that in terms of competing societies that are, right now, a big buzzword, high trust societies flourish better. And the reason they flourish better is because that underlying strata of communion is where trust fundamentally begins.
Yep.
And the rest of and that's where you get to pistis, faith, where pistis, in fact, is the underlying thing that allows the entire society. And we see this in churches. I see this in the collapse of my own denominational structure. You see this in the proliferation of non-denominational churches, because again, what churches are sort of naturally and organically doing when you have collapse, and this is one of the things I want to talk about at some point, because again, because of the prophets of modernity, we tend to imagine that apocalypse comes in one size, which it never does. Apocalypse is always scaling up and down. And what you're discussing here is when you look at, let's say, the apocalyptic vision. Well, if the prophets of the Christian story that begins in Genesis and ends in the book of Revelation, but that's the book of Revelation is built on the day of the Lord. So you have to go back to Joel and understand the Hebrew prophets in terms of the day of the Lord. And one of the things you realize very quickly about the day of the Lord is go back to Joel and you realize, okay, I'm reading about the day of the Lord. Is that a locust invasion or is that the Babylonians? And you say, oh, it's both. Because the day of the Lord, just like apocalypse, scales. But what you just related, of course, goes all the way down, because in the biblical story, communion begins in the garden, and it's the rupture of communion that, in some ways, as Jordan Peterson and others have pointed out, that the Eastern fathers have pointed out, the rupture of communion begins the story of civilization.
Yes, this is great. So this sort of let's sort of shift it into the next. That's the next stage. Like we just
Right.
moved across a really
Right.
nice spot. So, um, so within this new way of thinking about it, this new frame, let me recapitulate the problem of three, the third version of the meaning crisis problem. And what I'll do here is I'll use the language of image, or the language of worldview. But worldview itself to me already sounds modern. I like image better. So when we hear stories about the apocalypse, and we are relatively modern, we are watching a movie. We can't help it because we are dominated by the logic of Chronos. We think that all events at the end of the day are the kinds of events that the Enlightenment permits us to think about as reality. And then we're sitting our narrative on top of a deeper set of presuppositions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what has to happen is I have to say, well, okay, that means that the apocalypse has to be like a really super bad, collapse to end all collapses. Okay, cool. And by the way, the flood has to, in fact, actually have been a single universal event, because I'm actually assuming a historical timeline that is based upon an objective third-person view,
Right.
and Chronos, the chronological time, which is in context independent, like there's no context, it's completely just mechanical,
Right.
is reality. So now I have to take the Christian story and put it on top of that frame. And this is one thing that Pageau has been masterfully unwinding for whatever years. Now, if I say you have to undergo a metanoia, you have to undergo a profound transformation, a way of thinking about that profound transformation is you got to get rid of this image. You're going to be moving to a completely different image. And when we move to a different image, let's say for the moment we move to the medieval mindset, this is no longer Chronos dominant. Right? This is Kairos dominant. Right? The world is constructed of the fractal layers move like this, and there's many, many floods. Right? I have had several floods. I've experienced floods both in my life, and I've experienced floods in my relationships. And there is something like I love the Jewish version, like shalom, shalom. There's the flood. Okay, well, there we have an archetype of flood, which is more real than any given flood. Right? It's not, we're talking about a particular mechanical, physical flood. We're talking about something that is more real, the substrate of reality, flood, of which all floods are an image of that flood. Right. And each flood carries the aspects of that image in all kinds of interesting, powerful ways. And we can do the same thing with apocalypse. Right? Yep. An apocalypse is an apocalypse.
Exactly. And that isn't to say that floods aren't real.
No.
That biblical floods weren't real. It isn't to say that. You're just misunderstanding the way that the Bible talks. And this is, people have been plumbing that for a long time, because very quickly people want to say it's an either or, but it's like, no, it's not either or, but you have to understand your own monarchical vision in order to understand the sort of the false choices you're bringing to a book that didn't have those binaries to begin with.
Yeah. Okay. So now the language that you used earlier about high trust society, low trust society.
Yep.
And so if you want to respond to anything that really matters, anything that's somewhat complex, turns out you need a high trust society to do it.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
Yep.
Second step. Oh shit, we're not in a high trust society. It's going down. True. What do? How do you restore trust? Looks like it turns out communion is the deep substrate from which trust can develop. And this is, by the way, true in generally. Like you said, they're prophets, and they're prophets of something. You can form communion at the level of an indigenous group with their principality, and that is real communion. And it's actually something that creates real communion.
Yes.
We have the unique problem that we can't do that. We have to, if we want to solve our problem, we have to find a way to form communion which transcends all nations, that intrinsically integrates all nations into a larger community that can do that, which is actually a really interesting thinking about it as a design problem. I know a guy, but we'll get to him later. So you start walking down the stack, like, oh man, okay, big problem. Need a high trust society. Don't have a high trust society. Have to get back to communion. But I can't get back to communion with a simulation of Christianity, right? Just a propositional construct that is in fact inverted image. Not only does it not work, it actually radically gets in the way.
Right.
So for us to actually get into proper communion, we have to actually undo the consequences of the way that our current image separates us from the truth. And here I very specifically am making the distinction between a set of propositions that point to reality and a relationship with a person, right? Just that pivot, points us from a true story. Nope, we're not talking about true stories. We're talking about the truth. His name's Jesus. His name, he has a name. He is the name. He is the word. He is the logos. He is that which is the fabric that enables reality to hang together and be meaningful in its very essence. And we have to undergo whatever level of transformation is necessary to be able to completely exit a world which moves towards society intrinsically, to be able to re-enter a state of true communion from which all the rest becomes at least vaguely possible. Now, of course, as I'm sure you're very, very aware, once you do that, a lot of these other questions begin to drop out, right? Because you no longer think, I got to get to community. I got to get to communion so I can build community, so I can build a really cool organization that can build spaceships that can take us to Mars, right? Because you can no longer operate in a strategic mode at all. Because when you have undergone metanoia and you have, how does it say? You have sacrificed self. Then you notice, oh, well, the way this works is actually, I don't really make plans like that. He makes plans. I try to listen to what his plans are and I try to do them. So the whole approach shifts. And if you think about it, it's actually kind of straightforward. Strategy is very much part of the ligature of modernity. Modernity is an extremely strategic image. And we're saying, hey, that's like the last step of like the last slice of Western civilization. And what we're saying is that and Western civilization and capital C civilization are all going down at once. And we're moving into a portal that is in fact unique in history, and is of an order of magnitude, let's say, equivalent to the emergence of humanity at all. And lo and behold, if we move into this image, we notice in fact is exactly the same moment. We're living in a kairotic timeline, and the Adam in Eden and Christ on the cross and us at the moment of the apocalypse is the same moment. It's a ringing of a single bell. I can imagine this would be very disorienting, though, for everybody. It's very disorienting for me.
Jordan, I think of two images in pop culture in our zeitgeist. When we conceive of possible futures for where Western Civ, for where our culture is headed, we've got on maybe one end of the spectrum the image of sort of Mad Max dystopian world, ecological crisis, political crisis, whatever else precipitated that state of chaos. And on the other end of the spectrum, you had this Star Trek vision of the future. Why does it feel, from your vantage point, like we are in a state of civilizational transition? And how do we at least avoid the Mad Max at the end of all of this?
Well, I mean, in some sense, the simplest answer to the first part is because we are. It feels that way because that's where we are. But maybe we can double click on that and talk about what does it mean to say that we are, and how are we able to sense it? So let's see. At a very big picture, I guess the first part would be to say something like, it's at least somewhat possible to produce a meaningfully rigorous theory of civilization. That's the first point, which is to say that we're not talking about an arbitrary gesture or an emotional response to being unhappy with present circumstances, but rather let's step back and we zoom back our point of view and take a look at the long arc of history. And then by long arc, I mean 100,000 years or longer. Flag, I won't be speaking about Atlantis or anything like that. Let's assume for the moment that something like the basic story of history is reasonably accurate, which it might not be. And my friend John Vervaeke actually did a masterful job in his series, the epic series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, over, I think, like 50 or 60 episodes. And he does start in the Upper Paleolithic transition, right? So the birth of the Homo sapiens sapiens. And the point being that there's a way to take a look at this thing that we're doing, humans, culture, and then ultimately civilization, and be able to start saying things about it, being able to describe its fundamental dynamics, its characteristics, what makes it rise, what makes it fall, why do civilizations have this tendency to behave the way they behave? And then you can do diagnostics. You could effectively create a theory of civilization, and then you could do a diagnosis on the basis of that and say, okay, well, where are we? And this was work that I and a bunch of other people did back in the 2008 to 2012 timeframe. And this was because initially we didn't know each other initially, but we were all individually from where we were noticing that something deeper was going on. In other words, let's say the financial crisis of 2008, 2010. Okay, there's a financial crisis, but if you investigate it closely, you notice that it seems to not just be, okay, a bunch of weird loans were made to real estate, and well, something deeper is going on. Like, oh, well, financial crises happen. Why is that? Is this something that we can actually notice? There's a reason why these tend to happen in general, and this is a special case of the general process. For example, start pulling on that thread. So as I started encountering different people, Eric Weinstein, by the way, was one of the early people I encountered in this journey. His brother Brett, same day, but I didn't know that they were brothers at the time. And we started talking about this and started, hey, to be able to make sense of what's going on, we're going to actually have an orderly theory about how this stuff works. So go out, pull all the guys who've ever written about it in the past, read their stuff, see if we can take a look at existing complex system science and complexity evolutionary theory and differential geometry and apply it. And at the end of the day, we ended up producing something like a meaningful theory of culture and civilization. Okay. So, sorry, that's a lot of backstory, but the point then is to say there's a really, really solid pattern mapping between what's going on in our world and what it looks like when a civilization is in the process of the early stages of collapse. And here's some things that begin to happen. One is you get what I call systemic cascades. It's a little bit like a game of whack-a-mole, but where every time that you try to focus on one area, the solutions you put in place in that area push problems into other areas that you're not paying attention to. Right? So you try to solve the problem of, say, COVID as a virus, and you simultaneously produce a collapse of the economy and increased political polarization. Like, oh shit. So then you turn your attention to the economic collapse and you juice money into the system, which produces even higher political polarization. And by the way, pushes your financial consequences out into the rest of the world that creates geopolitical dislocation. And so this notion of these interlocking systems, as the crisis begins to move, it pushes on different systems differentially. But as we try to solve the problem, we begin to discover that our approach to solving problems is a principal part of the problem. Does that make sense? That
Absolutely.
last part is really critical.
Yeah.
If you've got a problem-solving toolkit that is functional, then you can solve problems. A problem comes, okay, I've got a leaky pipe, I've got a wrench, I fix it. You run into things get really hairy when one of two things happen, in particular when they start feeding back on each other. One is when the scope, magnitude, rate, or kind of the problems you're dealing with is outside of the capacity of your problem-solving toolkit. And that's one. The classic example is if there's one hole in the dike, you can solve it with one finger. This works all the way up to 10. But when you get to the 11th hole in the dike, you've got a whole different set of issues. And the other, which is deeper and more fundamental, is when it's actually part of the interior code of how you're running your society that is producing, it is at the base of the problems. Okay. So you'll notice interlocking systemic crises. You'll notice this weird game of whack-a-mole and cascades. You'll also tend to notice what I call hypertrophy or doubling down. When you don't know how to solve the problem, but you're not ready, willing, or able to go through the amount of transformation necessary to really respond to your circumstances, what you often do is you just push harder. And we're seeing this, of course, all over the place. All right. Now, here's an interesting thing I'm going to put out there. This came from the second stage of our work, which was, okay, well, how do we deal with it? How do we respond? It turns out that humans, Homo sapiens, how do I say this right? So imagine we're a long time ago, maybe 1 million years ago, and there's these really interesting, relatively sophisticated social hominids, like smart chimps, and they're able to do the things that other social hominids, and to some extent, pack animals like packs of wolves and hyenas can do. But they begin to be able to generate symbolic language. And they cross this weird threshold from being social hominids to being a cultural organism made up of social hominids. And what happens there is it produces this really amazing capability that only humans have. And that is the ability to produce what Brett Weinstein calls a niche transition. In other words, hyenas are well suited for the hyena niche. But if they go to the Siberia, they're going to die. Humans, because almost all of our adaptive code is moved into the cultural layer, can leave the Sahara, migrate up into the Anatolian mountains, and adopt a new cultural layer within a rate of speed that allows us to survive the transition and adapt to that new niche. So we have this capacity for cultural transition. All right, now check this out. We run roughly 2 modes. One mode is running the basic code of our culture. And we are Anatolian low foothill kind of folks. And that code, we work it out until it fits the niche properly. And we're relatively thriving in that context. And then we have another mode, which is we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. So we need to figure out how to be very liminal and experimental and learn and adapt rapidly. So kind of transitional and stitional. There's a third mode, by the way, which is a really bad one, which is we get stuck in our current culture. So we can't shift to the learning mode. We actually double down. But in our basic state, we have these 2 modes. And we also have this really interesting metastructure, which is a subtle set of signals that tell us it's time to shift. And just think like we're sitting, we're in a relatively lush valley. Things are going well for like 1,000 years. But the herds start to thin. The rain isn't coming. The water begins to dry up. And we need to have some ability to move from the optimized mode of running our basic cultural code to the, nope, time to pull up stakes and take the big risk of leaving the place we know and the place we know how to thrive and move and journey. And that's actually deep in our anthropological history and deep in our basic human code. So what that means is at a body level, like literally physically in our physical bodies and deep neurological structures, when there are subtle signals that our current cultural forms aren't functioning, we start to begin to change our behavior, change our way of perceiving reality, and most importantly, change our way of signaling each other that begins to build a distributed collective consensus in an unconscious register that we need to move from culture mode to learning mode. And so this is, by the way, why we can feel it. We're actually wired to be able to notice when the signs are shift from one mode to another mode. And this is, you see this like animals that notice when an earthquake is coming. There's a reason, like evolution will put these kinds of things in place. But the point is, it's subtle, it's unconscious. It's not clear. But things like high basal anxiety. If you just have a high basal anxiety, it's probably a good sign that whatever you're doing isn't fundamentally functional. And what'll happen when you're in that is you'll start looking around, trying to find alternatives. And the more you look around and can't find alternatives, the more that basal anxiety will kick up, which is more or less saying time to get the fuck out of here. And the more you'll begin to orient, by the way, and this is really interesting, you'll begin to look for people who map a different set of patterns. When culture is operating properly, we tend to orient towards a particular set of human typological patterns that would be known as hill climbers, or effective, or optimized. Right? So the classic example would be kind of like the good chief. So when culture is operating properly, we want the good chief, somebody who run our cultural code effectively and well, is able to organize people properly, has good justice, the good chief. But when we're moving into this learning mode, the good chief is no longer the proper pattern, because the whole point is we have to not really dropping the chief as much as we're dropping the cultural code that he runs, which means he's not particularly well suited for leading that or participating in it.
Because it's not working
so
anymore, right?
Because it's not working anymore. And it's not because he's failing. It's because the underlying code is no longer fit for purpose.
And the environment has changed.
Exactly. So what happens is we move to another archetype, which is the shaman. Right? The shaman is precisely the kind of the reserve. It's almost like the appendix of our cultural typology. Mm-hmm. The reserve who always lives between, never fully optimized for the current environment. And so when it's time to move into the liminal, you turn to the shaman and say, okay. And the shaman wakes up and looks around and goes, I have no idea, but that's okay. I feel comfortable having no idea because I'm a shaman. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. And then this begins to create these feedback loops that activate us into a collaborative shamanic mode. And then we begin to migrate to this new place. And so that's another thing you'll see happening. You'll see people beginning to seek that, and they'll be listening for voices that have these voices of the prophetic, right? To move it from an anthropological mode to the kind of the more classical mode. That's the prophet, right? So you move from the king to the prophet. And by the way, because we've had enough circumstances, particularly within the context of civilization, of being stuck in this weird third mode where the culture has become ossified into a self-perpetuating architecture that has a series of feedback loops that are no longer connected to our autochthonous capacities, but are an unintended consequence of the way the institutions work. We get stuck. What that means is that we have this weird bifurcation where our reality is stuck, but our more sort of basic human mode is beginning to move further and further from that reality. And it feels really high tension because we're looking for prophets, but we don't have any prophets showing up. And anytime a prophet shows up, they get routed into some other role that it takes them away from the prophetic sensibility, and things get very intense. They get very, like, there's a lot of how do you say it? It's like pent up energy that's, it's like when you have a steam engine and you've got it tightly bound, but the steam is just getting stronger and stronger, starts shooting out all over the place like that.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.